think it's imperative for you guys to watch the entirety of this video before commenting or liking or disliking this video. Otherwise, it's impossible for you to know what's going on here if you're just looking at the title. Now that we've taken that out, we've settled it, let's just get into the video. So, why have men become useless in today's world? I think there are two big reasons as to why this has been the case. So, number one is the role of men as the protector. So, in today's world, this wonderful society that we've built, it's relatively safe, thus rendering men's job as the protector useless. I mean, just look around you, right? There's no more saber-toothed tiger that will just lunge at you randomly because we've moved away from that. Unlike during our days in the African savannas. So, this wonderful civilization that we've built, we've been so good at it to the point that safety is now guaranteed. Of course, there are exceptions in extremely crime infested countries. But if you're in a developed world with, of course, some exceptions also, it's relatively safe. And the role of the man as the protector has now been outsourced to the state by way of the police force and to a lesser extent the armed forces. So, yeah, men in this regard have become obsolete. Now, the other thing that I want to talk about is men's role as the provider. So, when women join the workforce en masse, it has made the role of men as the provider not so important anymore when it comes to women choosing their partners. Because back then, look, if you weren't a particularly good looking guy, if you just had a good job, a blue collar job that is, and you've got your act together, well, you can land a wife. That's not the case today, which I'll be explaining a little bit later on in this video. So, with women joining and earning money as well, um, this makes the role of the men as a provider less important, which means they can have higher standards or they can have other things that they can look at when it comes to finding a mate. Okay, so those two things, I think, they're the biggest reasons as to why men have essentially become useless in today's world. Now, of course, this has ramifications and consequences, which I'll touch upon now. Now, the fact that women, when it comes to sex and relationships, they've essentially become so much more powerful, right? So there's an obvious power imbalance going on here between the sexes. Since women have more power than men, it creates a gender imbalance, skewing power and the bargaining and leverage in their favor. Because look, back then it was a relatively fair and mutualistic relationship in which women gave men companionship and sex, and the product of that is children. And in return, men gave women protection and gathered resources for them. But because of the things I've mentioned earlier, the protection and resource gathering isn't really that important anymore. So, going back to the point, um, women having more power in the relationship and sex, well, I think about it like a monopoly because what do monopolies do? They are price makers, not takers. So they can set insane standards which are unfair and pretty much get away with it because again, by definition, they're a monopoly. So it's a similar case with men and women today, in which women have more power, and it's not only between it's not only restricted in relationships and sex. Institutions today are heavily favoring women. It's extremely unfair. And I'll give you an example. Okay, let's just look at it in the divorce courts. Women, when a divorce happens, they get half of the guy's assets. Um, they're entitled to alimony, and men will also have to give child support. And most likely, the custody will fall under the hands of women because just that's just the way the law is constructed. So there's another reason why women are more powerful than men. And it kind of, when you think about it, this whole issue about matriarchy, patriarchy, in the world today, in 21st century, we actually live in a patriarchy with all the examples that I've just enumerated. So the other consequence of this is that average men are essentially screwed in the dating scene. Because look, back then in the 50s, 60s, a man who had a blue collar job in manufacturing can buy a nice house in the suburbs and have 2 to 3 children, and he made enough money to be able to support his entire family. And on top of that, the man also had pension, health insurance, and all sorts of other benefits. Today, that's not the case anymore for a plethora of reasons, of course. Today, you need 2 to 3 jobs if you're an average worker just to get by, okay? And I'm talking about just getting by. Of course, the reasons are a plethora, as I mentioned earlier. Inflation is also killing the purchasing power of wages, and wages are not rising to cover up for the increasing standards of living, right? So going back to the point, average men are screwed. So a large portion of the populace, with regards to men, won't have a shot at a relationship with women. They don't get the time of the day. And this is horrible, okay? Simply because they don't live up to the standards that most women look up to today. Of course, there are other reasons as to why this is the case. Because of societal pressure, because of the stuff they see in social media, because of the social engineering of Hollywood, etc., etc. Now, you can't have a large chunk of the population disenfranchised, depressed, lonely, anxious, and a whole slew of other mental impairments that come with the fact that most men can't have relationships and have access to sex. It's really a recipe for disaster. It's a ticking time bomb, okay? And we're already seeing the side effects of this. A lot of men are killing themselves. A lot of them are drinking themselves to death, and they indulge in all of these other unproductive and self-destructive hobbies such as excessive gaming, pornography, right? And it even goes to a point in which they take out their anger and pent-up frustration towards others by way of mass shooting, right? So for as long as this trend goes on, that there's a strong divergence, a great imbalance between the sexes, we're only going to see problems that are increasingly worse, and it's really not going to end up well. And I think that's a subject. The solutions to these problems, well, that's a subject for another video.